Community, Culture, and Schooling. Part 4 in a series describing God's providence early in the career of a college professor. I was so pleased with myself for finding the perfect instructor for community, culture, and schooling, and so anxious and frustrated when she called to back out just a few days before the course started. I was in charge of a master's cohort for teachers on an Indian reservation. It was I who proposed it a year and a half ago. It was I who persuaded the dean to let us deliver it on the reservation, 60 miles from our college campus. It was I who stood up in front of the school board and persuaded them to let us use one of their classrooms. It was I who recruited 28 teachers, more than had ever been enrolled at one time in our master's program. No way could I let those 28 teachers show up to an empty classroom next week. It was an important and sensitive course. To understand how a school works or why it doesn't work, you have to understand students' background, their parents, the community, and its history and culture. That was a touchy subject. On the one hand, tribal leaders would want to make sure Ojibwe history and culture were shown in a positive light. On the other, the teachers were painfully aware of the poverty and family dysfunction on the reservation and its effect on children's learning. I couldn't replace the perfect instructor with just anyone. As the time I needed to find the right person ticked away, a fearful realization dawned. I'd have to go out there myself. Me, who knew nothing about the history of the reservation or its culture, or anything else the teachers would supposedly learn in that course. In the days that followed, I prayed for the Lord's help, and He did not disappoint me. On the lonely drive out to the reservation for the first class, I reviewed what I planned to say to the teachers. I was going to be honest. I was going to tell them I'd be learning alongside them. I needed their help in finding resources. I needed to draw on their experience in the classroom with parents, in the community. What each of them already knew from these sources would constitute a large part of what everyone else would learn in the course. Who better to learn from than colleagues whose knowledge and judgment parallels ours and could shed more light on what each of us has already experienced? My no-show instructor had ordered a textbook and had loaned me her copy. For the first class, students had been assigned to read a chapter on land rights. That was what I was prepared to discuss with them. Land use on an Indian reservation is complicated, especially here on an open reservation, where privately owned land can be sold to outsiders. Many whites lived on the reservation side by side with tribal members. Descendants, people with some proportion of native ancestry, but not enough to qualify for tribal enrollment, were a third group in this mix. Discussing these nuances with the teachers, I was surprised to learn that what interested them most about land use and tribal enrollment was hunting rights. Some of them hunted. Others were married to hunters. By treaty, tribal members are exempt from state hunting and fishing regulations on tribal lands, in season and out of season. They can catch as many fish and shoot as many deer as they like whenever they like. Non-tribal members feared wildlife stocks would be depleted and there'd be none left for them. This was a minefield I wasn't prepared for. Someone suggested we call in a local official of the U.S. Bureau of Land Management, BLM. But would he give tribal perspectives short shrift and make everything worse? To my relief, it turned out he was a tribal member himself. His knowledge of law and local history enabled him to explain views on all sides of hunting and fishing issues, and many others as well. Teachers respected him. Strong views from the previous meeting were expressed with more moderation. Though not directly relevant to what went on in local schools, that discussion built trust in the class, showing teachers that strong differences of opinion need not be divisive. The history of education on the reservation was more relevant to teachers' professional challenges, but also more sensitive. In the late 19th century, an order of nuns established a boarding school there. Besides promoting Catholicism, they hoped to integrate children into the rest of society by teaching them English, reading, and trade skills. The results were not what they'd hoped for. Few native children were assimilated. When they returned to the reservation, many no longer felt they truly belonged. Having been separated from their families during adolescence, they never learned child-rearing skills, and the impact could be seen in the upbringing of their own children and their children's children. Though the school closed in the 1940s, many believed it wasn't just ineffective in preparing children to enter the larger society, but had actually caused lasting harm on the reservation. This chapter of the book was painful to read. I sensed some of the teachers resisted it, especially the conclusion about the long-term harm to family life on the reservation. Time to call in reinforcements again. This time it was the tribal historian who came to the rescue. A longtime resident of the reservation, he knew former students of the boarding school and explained that not all regretted their experience there. Some appreciated the skills they learned as well as the food, shelter, and clothing the school provided. Others bitterly resented harsh discipline, the prohibition against speaking their native language, and enforced separation from their families. Traces of both appreciation and bitterness survive to this day. There was an active Catholic church in the community, but some tribal members wanted nothing to do with it because of the school's history. Once again, this balanced presentation by a tribal member reduced tension among teachers. Clearly, we needed multiple voices to get to the truth. Though teachers found reservation history interesting, they were skeptical about any suggestion that Native culture might have an impact on the school. They saw poverty, not culture, as the main cause of low student performance. They were eager to read Ruby Payne, who wrote about the social norms of intergenerational poverty, claiming that they conflicted with middle-class values that promoted success in school and upward mobility. At their request, I arranged for a consultant trained at Payne's Institute to discuss implications of her work for classroom teachers. I doubt that either the book or the consultant shed much new light on what teachers already knew about poverty and its effects on schooling. They were all too familiar with the challenges of educating children who came to school hungry, had inadequate health care, or were exposed to family trauma. I sensed, though, that they needed this opportunity to talk through these issues and share ideas about how to deal with them. As I pointed out at the start of the course, their collective experience was an important part of the curriculum, and the insights of colleagues are as important as those of outside experts like Ruby Payne or our textbook author. Rewarding as it was to the teachers, the discussion of poverty on the reservation did not prove what they'd hoped to prove, that Native culture does not play a role in students' performance in school. As the semester drew to a close, this was emerging as the central issue of the course. For the longest time, I was at a loss how to resolve it. As the weather turned warmer and I resumed the long solitary walks with the dog that I'd abandoned when winter closed in, I prayed frequently over this quandary. On one of those walks, the Lord heard my prayer. An idea sprang into my mind, so simple and obvious I was amazed it hadn't occurred to me weeks before. To decide whether Native culture influenced students' performance in school, all the teachers had to do was examine their own experience and search for conversations or incidents that in some way involved race or ethnicity. In preparation for our next class, I would ask each teacher to write a paragraph describing an example like this. If the exercise worked, it would show that despite their skepticism, these factors really did affect how students thought and acted in school. The connection they'd been trying to downplay would be demonstrated through their own observation. I thought long and hard about how to compile what the students brought to class, and finally settled on a low-tech option, a roll of butcher paper and a package of markers. Arriving in class early, I set up 3 6-foot tables end to end at the front of the classroom, and unrolled 18 feet of butcher paper. I then drew a line across the length of the paper and marked off intervals for kindergarten through 12th grade. I worried that my assignment might draw a blank, but excited chatter at the start of class reassured me. On cue, teachers crowded around the 3 tables, writing a phrase or two at the designated spot to summarize what they'd observed. When they finished, we surveyed the butcher paper, showing the influence of culture on schools laid out in vivid color across the full span of grade levels, and I had them explain what they'd written. In first grade, children knew about race but weren't really sure what it meant. A white boy on the playground proudly proclaimed he was Indian. In third grade, children began to take pride in their ancestry and were willing to share it with classmates. A girl wore her jingle dress to school, performed a dance to explain its significance, and was applauded by classmates. By 6th grade, peer groups defined by race became more distinct, and students were curious about how others perceived them. A teacher observed a group of Native boys listening at the door of a room where white boys were working, apparently trying to hear what was said about them. Race became more disruptive in 9th grade, when group loyalties grew more intense and were reinforced by open conflict with outsiders. A group of Native students openly rejected school, refused to do work teachers assigned, and mocked their native peers who tried harder. Resurrecting an old racial epithet, they called themselves savages and acted the part. Studious native peers they called apples, red on the outside, white on the inside. By the end of 10th grade, disruption abated. By state law, students were permitted to leave school at 16. By the end of the school year, nearly all those calling themselves savages were gone. It's always gratifying when students are able to answer their own question. The developmental narrative these teachers had laid out clearly showed that race did affect schooling. The evidence they had supplied was irrefutable. But it also showed why they believed it was poverty, not race, that made teaching so hard. Viewing students at just one grade level, first or third or sixth grade, anyone would have thought race affected their schooling very little. Until you stood back and saw the entire trajectory, you wouldn't realize its impact. This effect was not the noxious, discriminatory kind that teachers recoiled from. The system wasn't rigged against native students. The apples did as well as their white peers. The savages disdained to make any effort at all. Rather, the difference between these groups and between them and whites lay in how students saw school, either as a path to opportunity or as an alien institution they wanted no part of. The divide that developed among students as they grew older suggested that school itself had little influence on how they perceived what teachers had to offer. These attitudes were shaped by family, culture, and community, factors over which teachers had no control. I didn't stay at the college long enough to see the results of the master's program. The year I taught community, culture, and schooling was my 5th year at the college. Along the way, I'd collected some serious adversaries. Starting the master's program on the reservation ruffled feathers. By spring, my position was precarious, so I applied for jobs at other universities. After I moved out of the area, I kept in touch with my successor, and it was through him that I learned the results of the program. Teachers who completed their degree gained confidence, a richer repertoire of instructional strategies, and insight into the needs of their students. Some of them understood the reservation better. Most found it easier to build trust with families. Looking back on our experience together, I'm thankful to have had the chance to teach them and play a small part in their professional growth. I'm glad to have done what little I did to bring peace to them, allay their anxiety, and help them cope more easily with the stresses that went with their jobs. Whatever I accomplished in that course, I did not do on my own. Coming in at the last minute, teaching about a topic I knew almost nothing about, I could easily have floundered and made a fool of myself. But I was not working alone. I prayed daily. The Lord led me. In the very beginning, when my perfect instructor backed out and I had no idea how to proceed, he gave me the confidence and conviction to learn along with the students and to rely on them for the resources we needed. When the debate about hunting rights left me speechless, he sent me a wise man to restore calm and shed light in dark places. When we stumbled over the painful topic of the Catholic boarding school, he sent a peacemaker to put salve on the wounds of an historic injustice brought about by good motives. When I despaired of proving to teachers that students' cultural background affects their schooling, he showed me how. If that was all he did, I might have thought I pulled this off through my own ingenuity and insight. But the host of new allies without whom I could never have launched a master's program on that reservation makes that unthinkable. I'm not a particularly friendly or sociable person, but countless people came to my aid in the year I spent planning that program. The dean who encouraged me at the risk of alienating senior faculty members, the testing proctor who gave up a night to drive out to the reservation and administer an admission exam, the graduate secretary who found an ingenious way to expedite student admission, 2 passionate and talented teacher leaders who recruited 26 of their peers to be part of the program, the school board chair who stood up against other board members to let us use space in their buildings, and finally the district superintendent who championed the program and eventually became my successor. Only the Lord could have recruited that small army to help me start that program, and only He could have helped me to fill the gap when my perfect instructor backed out of the course I'd assigned her.